ISAF forces. Surely one has some right in this matter, when you talk about a democratic Iraq, to look at the record of the United States in post-conflict situations.
By all means, but you'd be making the case. But then you would surely, therefore, be making the case, in fact, you just were, for more intervention or better intervention rather than less. Come on, listen to your own argument.
No.
The fact is the population of Afghanistan has gone up by 1.5 million of its citizens who want to come back. Don't forget the 4 million Iraqis forced to live outside their country who also have the right of return, and the condition of at least 50% of the population, those of the feminine gender, is obviously improved. It's no longer the headquarters of a lethal conspiracy. That's not bad for a year's going.
I don't disagree with Christopher that if you're going to do intervention, you need to do more. The fact of the matter is that Iraq is a place that needs more of our resources than it has now, and we're about to take on a major new challenge. And I think we all tell...
I'm sorry, I think you meant to say Afghanistan, didn't you?
Afghanistan
is a place that needs more of our resources. Yes.
We all tell our children, finish your old job right before you take on something new and more difficult. And I think the fact of the matter is that Afghanistan is desperately insecure. Kabul is in a place where there are very few peacekeepers. Warlords and drug lords patrol much of the rest of the country. We have not made serious commitments with regard to democracy building. We're years away from free and fair elections. And if that's a situation there, what will be the situation in Iraq in a year from now?
Let me just ask this. Go ahead, Michael, and then I'll come back.
We would have to do, the one successful example is Germany after World War II. We would have to conquer Iraq entirely. We would have to occupy it for years. We would have to rebuild it with massive investment. And all that was done by a much better government, a government in the United States, much more committed to democracy in Europe than we have now, a government that doesn't seem to be really committed to democracy in Afghanistan, and only rhetorically, I think, to democracy in Iraq.
That all sounds like hard-headed and realistic and practical, but in fact it's extraordinarily utopian. I mean, do you not agree with me that the implosion of the Saddam Hussein regime is coming? That you will either have to face a collapsed and imploded Iraq with or without a policy very soon. Now, to say that there will be innumerable difficulties here, as there are in Afghanistan, seems to me to be no more than trite.
Well, I don't think it's established that the regime is falling, Christopher. That gives you a very good reason to be able to say, well, there's going to be an intervention one way or another. But frankly speaking, simply from an American perspective, I have to come back to the John Adams question about whether it's the job of the United States to go out and defeat monsters. That, there is an assumption in the invasion talk that it is our job to make a democratic Iraq. And frankly, I challenge that as well. I'm not persuaded that it is the duty of the United States to create democracies. It is true that Ronald Reagan, whom you're now echoing, Christopher, said no small dreams for America. But I don't see why that entails us to do this. On what basis should the United States be determining the future of Iraq by force of arms? You can nitpick all you like about this issue of war on Iraq, war against Saddam Hussein. But when those bombs start to fall, they will fall on Iraqis, and they will largely not distinguish the politics, however carefully the targeting is done.
And if you think the Iraqis living today, and would they choose, as some have suggested, they would rather the United States come, and they're willing to pay some of that price. And I'm not suggesting
we have some evidence about that.
What's the evidence that Iraqis want to see United States and perhaps United Nations forces coming there to liberate them?
I'm saying that in the only place where opinion can be tested without fear or without coercion, it's practically unanimous. I wouldn't presume to speak for the citizens of Baghdad, and I actually don't think probably David Rieff should do so either. But we know that there's a very large Shia slum belt population around Baghdad, where Saddam City, it's called rather insultingly, where such opinion as has been tested seems very hostile to the regime. As I said earlier, there are 4 million Iraqis forced to live outside their country. We have a very good idea of what they think. I believe they have the right of return, by the way. There's a very, very strong indication that a regime, furthermore, that insists on 100% turnout and 100% vote isn't very sure of its popular base.
Okay, but there is an obvious point that you well know, which is that on the one hand, you can wish a regime would be overthrown. Another is to wish that somebody would come and bomb your homeland in order to overthrow the regime. Those are two very different points.
No, but these people say they wish that a regime change would come, and they believe it can only be conditioned from outside. Now, that wouldn't give the United States the right on its own, of course. You have to prove at least 3 or 4 other things, I believe. One, that Iraq is a threat to its neighbors, again, which it certainly is, and would be if it wasn't forcibly disarmed, even more so. Third, and I wish there was more emphasis on this, the evidence that Saddam Hussein should be tried for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and under the Genocide Convention need only be taken off the shelf. We have all the files necessary for that arraignment. I think it's to the disgrace of the U.S. government that it doesn't make use of them and say that that's another warrant that it's executing. That's unfortunately because it doesn't agree with the International War Crimes Tribunal, and indeed until today appointed for its own investigative commission someone who would also be hunted by it. I'm sorry, I can't speak for the administration. And then there's the question, which Dr. Coe would seem to be underestimated, of the connection between Saddam Hussein and international gangsterism. Last weekend, Saddam Hussein made a speech calling for a common front of jihad with the al-Qaeda forces in Kuwait against the British, the Americans, and the Jews.
Well, Christopher,
that's the day he hands over the documents.
We're still waiting.
He's the man who organized the Abu Nidal network. Yes, but you won't have to wait all that long, and all the pieces of evidence that we do have are very suggestive of at least a non-aggression pact between the Iraqi Ba'ath Party and the al-Qaeda network.
Michael made a very important point, which I think should not be lost, which is the multilateral route. The fact of the matter is that the situation in Iraq has been a multilateral matter now for more than a decade, and the Bush administration, after fainting down one road, has wisely gone down the road where it's coming into this situation with maximum international legitimacy. And I think having gotten to this point, it has to continue down that road if it's going to enter a post-conflict Iraq in a situation where it can actually do the building. The fact of the matter is, if the UN is not in on the takeoff of this, it will not be in on the reconstruction, and it will look like an American-imposed, quote, democracy. And I think it's important to say that this is not simply an issue about which liberals are in quandary. I think that much of the foreign policy team that surrounded the first President Bush has exactly the same set of concerns, and they are the ones who helped to push the multilateral route which the president has taken to this point.
Yep. If Christopher, sorry.
Go ahead, Michael, and then David.
If Christopher is right that Iraq is going to implode by itself, that's the strongest possible argument against
doing anything.
Let it happen, and let's see what social forces are at work there, and how they engage, and then maybe there would be an occasion to support the democratic movement inside Iraq if it appears.
That really is being callous about Iraqi lives. Well, that really is being callous about them, because that would mean that these changes and upheavals would take place with Saddam's helicopters and Republican Guard free to help decide the matter.
Well,
the argument for intervention is that that faction should be taken out.
Okay, Christopher Levitt, David.
Look, I come back to the principal issue that seems to be Americans need to think about here, which is does the United States, whether it's in the name of empire or human rights or both, really wish to start making various kinds of wars of altruism? Imperial domination and altruism, because you don't make wars like that without dominating as well. The notion that the UN will be anything more than a fig leaf seems to me quite unrealistic. The talk right now in the UN is that what is being proposed to them by the Americans is a one-year governorship under Tommy Franks, followed by a Kosovo-style proconsulate, for which apparently Bernard Kouchner, late of Kosovo, has already put himself up. Now, the UN in this context is doing will do the game of the Americans. But I mean, I just come back to the first principle. Do Americans, liberal Americans, conservative Americans, I take your point about the debate ranging far beyond liberals, hawks, or otherwise, but do Americans really want to start doing this as a matter of course? What surprises me is the lack of doubt on this subject.
Okay, but your principal objection to doing it, to using American force to create American ideals, is what? It will overextend us. It will make us weaker. It will make us hated. It will what?
My principal objection is that it is not for the United States to create, I emphasize the word create, democracies. The area Christopher alludes to is